Before we begin, we want to let you know that we had a little difficulty with our audio recording. Not to worry, though, Dr. Iasenza sounds great, and it's one of our favorite episodes, so definitely worth listening. Hope you enjoy it.
Sometimes I'll say to people, make them laugh a little humor in therapy doesn't hurt. But I say, you know what, all sex is group sex. And then they laugh. No, and I'll say, because when you're in bed, you think you're just with one partner. You're not. You're with your parents, with your grandparents, the intergenerational trend. And yeah, some people go,
Welcome to LOVELINK, your guide to love and sex in all forms. We're your hosts, Simone Humphrey and Sina Simon. Our guest today is Dr. Suzanne Iasenza. She's a clinical psychologist specializing in sex therapy and human sexuality research. She's written extensively on how couples can transform their sexual narratives to open up exploration and curiosity about what brings them pleasure. In addition to her clinical work, she's on the faculty of the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis and Adelphi University's Derner Institute postgraduate program in psychoanalysis. We're so excited to have her here today.
Okay. Welcome. So glad that you could be here with us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks.
So I guess to start us off, we just wanted to hear a little bit about what got you interested in sex therapy and working with patients around sexual issues.
I started in grad school, actually, when I was at NYU in psychology, and a very good friend of mine, when I was trying to think of a dissertation topic, she was working for the Department of Health in HIV and safer sex. And she said, and she had a PhD in sexology, and she said, the whole field of sexology is so interesting, which I had not heard about. Went all the way through a doctoral program, that one course in sexuality. So she gave me her dissertation, which was about the sexual lives of women post breast cancer and mastectomy, and it was just incredible. It blew me away. And I realized, it's a kind of field that's so interdisciplinary. It covers history and religion and class and race and gender relations and health issues. So it really appealed to me. So I said, give me a reading list of everybody you admire, who you studied in grad school. And she gave me a list, and I said, that's it. So then I just started thinking about how did I want to actually apply it to something that was more specifically interesting to me. And at the time, I was doing a lot of work about sexual orientation and Kinsey's work, and thought, let me do something on female sexuality, but as it relates to the fluidity around sexual orientation and sexual functioning.
Would you mind maybe briefly explaining the Kinsey sexuality scale? Because I think that's something that seems really relevant to your work and really interesting and great to hear.
Yeah, Kinsey, and there's a couple of movies now about Kinsey. I don't know if you've seen any of them, and there are some books that have been written about him. It's so fascinating, but it was really a paradigm shift. Prior to that work, and he did the male study, I think, in 1948, and the female study in 1953. Think about that. And he did it in the Midwest. Often I'll tell my Midwestern joke. If anybody's from the Midwest, I say, a lot of people on the East Coast or the West Coast think we're always the really progressive ones, the ones who break ground. But really the two greatest sexologists were from the Midwest, because Kinsey was doing his work in Indiana, and Masters and Johnson were doing their work in St. Louis.
Unexpected.
So, can you believe it?
Yeah.
And the kind of work they did, finding subjects, certainly Masters and Johnson's work was even more radical, because they found people, when you think about it, in the 50s and 60s, to come into a lab and go behind a one-way mirror, get undressed, have sex, while people in white lab coats are taking notes. Can you believe that? I think if we tried to do that research us now, we'd probably get arrested. Absolutely. Or certainly not get funding.
Yeah.
And then Kinsey wasn't doing that kind of research, but still he was asking, they developed this remarkable, interview that was, really where they sat and talked to people. And it was very in-depth about a vast assortment of sexualities and sexual experiences or functioning. But one thing that came out of Kinsey was this real paradigm shift. Prior to his research, people, well, first of all, homosexuality is pretty much a secret anyway, a secret life, but I think people basically thought a binary, if they did think. People were either that way, which at that point was kind of the sick people, the perverted people, and then there were the healthy ones who were heterosexual. And then when Kinsey came up with that continuum, it was a real paradigm shift. And if you go back and read the responses to that work, it was really intense, very negative. Like he got slammed by religious folks. They got slammed by psychoanalytic folks. There was a lot of pushback. A lot of people were threatened by it because, if you at least have your own little category, then I know who you are, right, in relation to me. But the idea that people were that fluid and so many people occupied that bisexual range, because I think they found that 10% of people were in the more same-sex, either attraction or behavior. And then I think it was at least 50 or 60% were on the heterosexual. But still, that left too much of an uncomfortable middle ground, even 20 to 30%. And people were like, who are those folks? Oh, if you're my next door neighbor, now you could be, interested in me, and I thought you were married to this man, and, so it really, I think it changed the whole field. And he died young, actually. Some people thought so much of that pressure just was so difficult for him, but he really broke ground. And now we use that continuum idea, right, about gender, and gender identity. I mean, it really applies to so many other things in gender and sexuality. So really such a gift. And I have to say, clinically, that you would think everybody kind of knows Kinsey's name, but so many patients actually still have trouble sometimes accepting the fluidity they have within their category. So let's say a heterosexual person can come in, and I always ask in sexual histories, which I do individually, not together, so that the halves of couples can hopefully feel free to answer certain questions that I would put more in the private realm, like masturbation. Not all people share with their partners their masturbatory behaviors or their fantasies. And I also ask about same and opposite sex sexual experiences, and like for a heterosexual person to say, well, I actually do have some same-sex attraction, they could say that with so much shame still. Even now, when you think we have marriage equality, so there's been so much progress with homosexuality, but for some people, they don't get that the fluidity is really more normal than not. Or gay people who can come in and say, oh my God, I had a dream last night if I want to have sex with this, opposite sex person, and they think, what's wrong with me? Should I break up? Maybe I'm not gay. They get very kind of concrete about the fluidity.
There's really a pressure to identify, and I think still quite a bit of stigma against bisexuality.
Absolutely.
Yeah, people don't think it exists. A lot of people are like, they deny that, right. If they're bisexual, they're really, they're
gay,
gay
who are not out of the closet, right?
Or they're just experimenting.
Yeah, there's a lot of still biphobia. It's really, you would think, really, how come about that? But it's almost like in the trans community, too, where some folks could feel like who want to occupy the genderqueer area, so they intentionally don't really say I'm either male to female, female to male, or I want to be ambiguous, or I want to be blended, or there's so many different words, and that some people feel that they make people more anxious. See, I think in human terms, and maybe anthropologists could answer this better, that probably there's a biological reason for why we want to know who you are, because then I know who I am. And, there might be something that feels safe about that. But certainly it wreaks havoc on the psychological level, can on the relational level.
It denies certain parts of us that then are really repressed.
Absolutely.
Or not expressed.
Yeah. Probably I'm trained as an analyst, not just as a sex therapist. And the thing I like about psychoanalytic work is that there's a playfulness and openness about the fluidity, at least of the psyche, we're doing dream analysis, for instance, so that when you're trained in dream analysis, you know that you could dream anything, and it doesn't mean concretely. So let's say if you're a married woman to a man and you have a dream about making love to your best friend, female friend, that doesn't mean, oh my God, I'm a lesbian. It would mean like, well, who is who, and actually, well, who is that other woman? Maybe it's a part of yourself that you're embracing, or you're more, like there's so many ways to analyze dreams. So analytic work really allows for that kind of fluidity of the psyche in ways that some other psychological fields or just the general public could be much more concrete.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the idea of fluidity. Mm-hmm. So, because there's also the idea that you can be emotionally attracted to either the same sex or opposite sex, and then sexually attracted to the other sex.
That's a good point. It's really work that was done after Kinsey. One of the people who I don't know if you know about, who I like a lot, is Fred Klein's work, right? And he published a book called The Bisexual Option. And actually, that he originally was interested in really opening up the field about bisexuality, but he developed an instrument based on Kinsey with several of his colleagues that is called the Klein Sexual Orientation Grid. And what he argued is that one of the limits of Kinsey's work is Kinsey's continuum only measured behavior and attraction. So it's who do you actually have sex with, men or women, and who you're most attracted to if you're walking down the street, men or women. Actually, Klein and his colleagues said there are actually 7 different aspects. So they broke that down into attraction, behavior, emotional preference, and then they had fantasies, which we love that, right? The fantasies, the dream life. And then they also had, I think, social identification. So, like, who do you like to hang out with, men or women? And then there was another one about who would you like to hang out with, gay people or straight people? And then there was self-identification. So how do you define yourself? Do you say I'm gay? Do you say I'm straight? Do you say I'm bi? So they had those 7 different aspects. And so you imagine 7 continua, and they documented all this research where people could be all over the map, right? And then how do people really relate to that kind of fluidity? You're absolutely right. It could be challenging.
So when you are on a spectrum and you are more fluid with your sexuality and you are committed to a partner that's sort of set in their gender and sex, I mean, how do you work with that with a couple when it doesn't always match?
Yeah, and for some people, they come in with that as the presenting problem, or sometimes not. It sometimes emerges in the work. But I do have an element in my work where I like to empower patients. I'm an educator. I'm not just a therapist, so I do a lot of training and teaching. And so I really think that it helps for people to become educated about some of this research or some of this theory. So I will talk to people about Kinsey. I talk to people about Klein's work and what the results were on how this fluidity can be there, and there's nothing wrong with it per se. Hopefully to release enough of the shame that people might have, or the concern, whether it's self-pathologizing or other pathologizing, to say, could we just be curious about it? Can we move it from what's wrong with you or me to what does it mean? And what does it mean for you as a couple? So that, let's say if you have the bisexual woman with the lesbian woman, the woman who has had, like on those 7 scales, all women, and the other one could be a little fluid, has been with men, may still sleep with a man if they had a chance, or whatever the mixture is. So what meaning does that have for you in your relationship right now? What's threatening about it? What could be exciting about it? And some women might say, for instance, let's say the lesbian all the way down the line might say, well, I can't compete with a man. That's what's threatening. I've heard that in therapy. Some women say, well, at least if my female partner wanted to be with this other woman, I feel like at least I can compete. But if she's into this man, how am I going to compete with the man? Mm-hmm. So that's sometimes what some people will say. Or some people just don't like the idea of it, or, So hopefully I help people, and when I'm working with a couple, because I do some of that, all the sexual history taking separately, it gives me an opportunity, if that were a presenting problem, to be able to ask what's complicated about it in a couple context, but then I could ask them individually what's complicated about it. And within a context of doing a whole sexual history, from when I start with a question, what's your very first memory of sexuality? So we could be starting a sexual history with their first memory at 5 or something, and tracking all of the narratives that come out of that history. Then also, if you're uncomfortable with your partner's bisexuality, there could be something in their history that contributes to that discomfort. that might relate to sexual fluidity or not. It could be relate to something else. Let's say that person's father had an affair. And what could be kind of woven into that fear of my partner's bisexuality is that I saw my mother suffer with my father's infidelity, and unconsciously even, that person could be kind of conflating their partner's sexual fluidity with then the potential of infidelity, right? And they might not even be aware of that. All they could be doing is shaming their partner or freaking out the night they found the partner shared with her, their fluidity. You know what I'm saying? So
bringing this into awareness, bringing this into consciousness, having it be a part of the conversation doesn't push away those memories and feel like it's taboo or take it out on your partner without even realizing it. You're really getting it into part of the relationship.
That's right, and part of one's individual history. So to be curious with whatever, and this is generally how I do couple therapy, whatever the issues, yes, how did it get co-created, or how does it have a life within that couple? But also, what were you bringing in already that you brought on board, either consciously or unconsciously, that co-created that in the life of the couple?
Right.
And sometimes much more of the source of the conflicts or issues are even before they even met this person, but they apply it, they attribute it to this person. And that's when you can have people say, I should just break up with this person and replace them with someone else, and it's going to be better. And then if I do a sexual history or general history, I say, well, you know what? It could be these issues are going to piggyback right onto your next relationship. It doesn't necessarily is contained with this partner. Right. I think that's a really important couples function, is to help people, kind of separate that out. Mm-hmm. How much am I bringing to the table that, already was there before I met you? Right. And then how much God really co-created between us for who we are. Right?
This is making me, as we're beginning to talk about seeing couples and therapy, I'm thinking about how difficult it is for a lot of people to talk about their sexuality, to talk about their sexual histories. I mean, it's a lot to ask of people as they're coming in.
You bet.
In our culture, we're not very good about talking about sex, and people don't have models when they're growing up. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen many patients who never have talked about sex with anybody before.
That's right.
So I'm curious how you get people comfortable talking about sex.
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually, the way I conceive of it is if I can help them feel comfortable talking with me first, and then I can transfer it over to them. That at least that's kind of the way I approach it, that I find can be helpful. That's one of the reasons why I do the sexual history taking individually, because there are pros and cons. You could do it either way. When I was initially trained, actually, it was keep the couple together. And some couples therapists really believe you should always keep the couple together, so you never see them separately. There are a lot of different theoretical, perspectives about that. But with the sexual part of a person's life, I think because there is the difference between secrets and privacy, which, people should know about, and there is this private part. Like, let's say, often when I explain this to couples, I'll say, what could be private? Like masturbation. And that isn't a secret like, oh, you're bad because you don't tell your partner you just masturbated this morning in the shower, or you're not being secretive because you don't share with them what you fantasized about. Now, some couples might say, well, they shouldn't have any secrets. Like when I ask couples, I don't tell them. I tend to ask them, do you know something called privacy, secrecy? Do you have a notion of what privacy is? Some couples will say to me, well, I don't know. It wouldn't be healthy for anyone to have even a private thought. Like if you're masturbating, I should know. Or if you have an attraction, I should know. And if it's not me, that's bad too. And it's all grist for the mill, right? Our jobs, I often say, that's where our countertransference can come in, right? You got to sit there. Like when I've had people actually say, oh no, every thought he has, I should know, because that's what a healthy relationship is. And, and let's say he believes the opposite. And then, of course, they could look at you and say, well, what do you think, Dr. Iasenza? And I'll say, well, last I checked, I didn't go to law school. I'm not a judge. I went to psychology, which means I help you decide what do you think about that difference. But, so it's really important that I have found it's more common than not that people have shame in their sexual histories. They have secrets or something they've never told anybody. So when I explain to couples why I think it's so important that I will be seeing you, often like in the first session I'll say, at some point when we feel we're ready, I will want to take complete sexual and family histories, and I do that separately. And let's talk about how you feel about that. And then I also make it very clear and this is so important, therapists can make this mistake if they don't ask this, but you want to make it clear, is this information you share with me confidential, or do you want it to be transparent? Meaning what you share with me would come back into the couple, and that's grist for the mill. What some therapists do is they just decide. Like some therapists would just say, it's confidential. But I like to, maybe it's the analyst part of me, maybe it's the troublemaker part of me, who knows? But there's a part of me that says, no, that could be part of the work, is to put that question to them and see what comes up. And in most couple kinds of issues, if they agree, there's not a lot of energy about that, right? But it's more if one person says, well, I think it should be confidential, and the other says, well, why should it be confidential? You have something, that you're keeping from me, and before you know it, it can open up. Are there any issues of trust they have, or questions? But I don't proceed with the individual histories until we have an agreement about that. And most of the time, I haven't had, in 30 plus years of doing this, I haven't had that be a deal breaker. In fact, it often can open up people's fears. It can open up fears of, brings up fear for me that he could maybe tell you things that I don't know. Yeah. Because there's a triangle in a couple therapy, and now you have some, even if it's not like the worst fear people could have is, oh, he's going to tell me he's having an affair, right? And she doesn't know. But sometimes it's just the idea that I may have a closeness with one partner, or a knowledge or an intimacy that maybe they don't know about. And other people, it could give you a little bit of an idea of how how differentiated people are, right? From Bowen's work, and how comfortable do they feel that a partner can have a private thought, share it with me. But ultimately, when I do see them individually, and my histories can be like, I could take 4 or 5 sessions, sometimes more, with partners individually. So when you think about what that means with weekly psychotherapy, and sometimes couples want to continue the couples work. It could be either I see the couple every week and I'm seeing the separate couple, the partners each week too, so that could be 3 sessions a week, or it could be every other week, couple, one partner, couple, one partner. But it could take months to get sexual history taking, which I also find can be very therapeutic, because it means that in whatever way they could feel shame or have secrets or just feel very embarrassed to talk about sexuality, it's unfolding in a very kind of gradual way. This isn't like throwing someone into the deep end of the pool. It's really having a great deal of respect for this area of a very private area for most people, and one that either known to them or unknown to them can contain a lot of shame or conflict or trauma. You have no idea what's going to come out in a sexual history. And sometimes people share things that they didn't realize until they're in the sexual history.
I think because these kind of questions aren't asked of people often, so much of it is unformed, unthought of. I mean, Sina and I, just right before this, were discussing our earliest memories of sex and sexuality. And just that alone kind of made me think of all of these memories that I hadn't really thought of.
That's right.
Some of which seemed odd now, some of which seem normal, and so I think it just really kind of makes you realize that there's so much that really goes kind of unspoken.
And things that you wouldn't even call sex then, that now when you're recalling, or in response to a question, or sometimes I would say, does that sound like something you would call sexual? And sometimes I say with trauma, for instance, it's very classic, where people could think that everybody has this experience at home, whether it's getting hit, or dad coming into your bed at night and doing things that feel weird or whatever, depending on the dynamics of that family or how people adjusted to that, or the loyalty issues and so forth. This is definitely the secrets part of it, that sometimes the first time people can begin to unpack that is in a sexual history.
What are the different components, if you just give like a brief rundown of the different components of a sexual history taking, what's involved in that? What are the topics that you talk about when you do that with a patient?
I think I bring a big narrative approach to my work. I love Michael White's work. And so I see the sexual history almost like a conversation, that it's an opportunity for someone who hopefully is non-judgmental, who's curious, who's going to ask questions just to help a person find out, well, how are they going to narrate this? What is their story? So I start with a question, what's your earliest memory of sexuality? That I ask everybody, and I deliberately ask about, say, sexuality and not sex. And sometimes it's not related to even sexuality. Like some people have started telling me about gender. identity.
Right.
I remember when I was a tomboy and they start telling me. So, or I have people who, let's say, a primary identity, skin color or race, who could start with, I remember the first time I really realized that my skin color was different than my best friend. Well, tell me about that story. Oh, I went into his house and so that racial identity or skin color was part of the body, and something called sexuality, which is really about identity, but that the primary identity or a relationship to body was around race or skin color. You never know, or it could be gender or gender identity. It's not, so that's why sexuality pulls for, unconsciously, a much broader kind of free association to it. If you think of it as the first ink blot you're showing them, if you're giving an ink blot test, sexuality, what's your association to that? And then wherever they start is fine. Some people might start with, my first memories when I was 16, which I would make note to self, like, why don't you remember anything before you're 16? But I wouldn't say that right off the bat. I'd just say, okay, what's your first memory at 16? Let them start to unfold that story. And then eventually I probably would come back and say, any hypotheses on why you don't remember anything before 16? Any stories anyone told you about your life before 16? Or what do you make of that? Mm-hmm. Right? But once they tell that first story, let's say they tell the story of the playing doctor. Oh, well, me and Johnny and Mary got together and we kind of undressed and look at each other. Then I'm thinking, okay, that's a very primary story. So now I really want to spend time with that story and unpack it. So once they told me about them and John and Mary, or whatever they were doing, then I'd say, oh, what do you think you were thinking when that was happening, or feeling, or sensing in your body? That's sort of like the EMDR kind of thinking of how are we processing things neurologically. And usually with most experiences, we have thoughts associated, things, feelings, and sensations in the body. So I'm kind of curious how those things are working. Then I'm also going to be thinking about, well, what was that experience like for that person, that first memory? Is it one that's pleasant? Oh, it was so much fun, and I had pleasure in my body. Was it, riddled with guilt or with shame? Some people tell me their first memory is actually, I remember, it was 9 o'clock, and then my dad's door opened, and he started walking down the hall, and I started getting that sick feeling, and they're going to tell me about a story of incest. You just don't know what story they're going to tell you. But whatever story they tell me, I sit with and help them become curious about, okay, their body came online in some way with this story about sexuality, their earliest memory. Let's get a sense of how that formed them, how their sexual narrative started with that beginning story. And then sometimes I might ask, let's say with the playing doctor, I might say, well, did anybody ever walk in on you? Did your mother or father or somebody else's? No. And then I get hypothetical. I might say, well, because now I want to know, in this little kid, what kind of context, familial, cultural, in terms of gender, race, class, whatever, within what context, historical, did they have that experience? So now I want to start bringing the circle out, the context from that internal body, thought, feeling, sensate kind of level to now we're going to get a little more social. So first, one of the social contexts will be family, right? So then I'd bring mom or dad in, or whoever their family was. So let's say mom did. So mom, no, nobody ever walked in on me. What if your mother did walk in on you? Mm-hmm. How do you think your mother would have reacted? So now we start to get into the what ifs, so that I could start to get a sense of, well, was this little kid's sexuality growing up or becoming alive or coming online within a permissive one? Or would the mother said, how dare you? And I've heard these stories. I mean, I hear incredible stories of shame right off the bat. How dare you? You'll never get to see Johnny and Mary ever again. I'm going and calling Johnny and Mary's mother. They do. Then Johnny and Mary are getting in trouble. It's a big deal. Don't you ever touch yourself like that again. I've had people tell me terrible stories in terms of masturbation and being caught, and then they're dragged into the living room, and my dad gave me the Bible and said, now read that Bible, and then they called my family in and said, see what Johnny was doing. Terrible stories.
Yeah. And even parents, I think, with the best intentions,
totally
are really uncomfortable often with little children having sexual experiences. And so even if they don't want to shame them, end up doing that inadvertently.
Yeah, and a lot of parents, one of the people I quote when I teach is Peter Fonagy. I don't know if you know his work.
Yeah, sure.
Well, Peter wrote a great article, one of his only, on sexuality, by the way, And one of the things he said in that, obviously he focused a lot on dysregulation as it relates to mirroring and being attuned emotionally just as a parent, right? And really good parenting is knowing your little child doesn't have the skills to know what that feeling is and how to relate, right? So you see Johnny, he's upset, he came out off the playground. Johnny, you look sad, what happened? Oh, did little Peter not play with you? Yeah, he played with it, and you know what, that makes sense. I would feel angry too, when I was a kid, and you help a kid digest that feeling, right? And you mirror them and you're attuned with them, and that's how kids grow up to be able to be kind of like emotionally regulated, right? You look at emotional regulation or dysregulation. And one point that Peter makes in this article around sexuality is that for most parents, they don't know how to mirror or be attuned to a little kid's sexuality. They either can err on the side of I see no evil, hear no evil, or they can be overly, interventionist, and with whatever anxieties or shame or guilt they have. And so he makes a point that because parents don't know and they're not taught how to sexually be attuned to their kids and to sexually mirror their budding sexuality, most adults are sexually dysregulated. It's a really interesting, so he takes the emotional dysregulation kind of frame and puts it onto sexuality. I just feel that so resonated for me in my work.
It's so important because, so many parents feel so intensely uncomfortable and then they get paralyzed, I think, most of the time.
Well, then it just gets perpetuated after generation after generation, so we live in a culture of shame around sex.
That's right.
So, actually, I have a question about masturbation and children because I was sharing the story with Simone that one of my friends has a 4-year-old who was masturbating in the living room. And she didn't know what to do.
Yes.
And I'm curious what you would do in a situation like that. Eventually the father picked her up and, said it's okay to do this, it's okay to masturbate, or however he described it in child language, but we do that in private. We do that in our room. But she was really paralyzed by it. She didn't know what to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting why the father, let's say, in that situation could do it and she couldn't.
Yes.
So let's say there were a couple I was seeing, hopefully with no shame, because she might feel ashamed, like, oh, God, I was so paralyzed and look, my husband had to do it. And I'll say, well, if we could reel that back a little, it's hard to explore anything we shame. But let's be curious about, I would probably at that point say, well, what are your memories in your childhood about how you masturbated? And what are your memories about, did your parents ever see you? Where did you masturbate? Because you wonder how much, when parents are frozen, it's something that, they're recalling or they're reliving, right? And I'd be very curious with that, with the husband. How come you were able to intervene? And intervene in it sounds like, pretty non-shaming way. Because certainly with kids' sexuality, one of the things when I talk to parents is you definitely want to mirror. Does that feel good, Mary? Oh, that's great that your body can feel that way, right? When you touch yourself that way, that's great. Our bodies are built to be able to feel those things. That's great. And sexuality is an area that often we want to do in certain places more than others, like our bedrooms or a bathroom, because sometimes, showing that to other people, that's a part, like when we bathe, right? Like when we take a bath. We don't invite, Grandma and Aunt Mary and Uncle Jim into our bathrooms, right? There's certain things about our bodies that we take care of, private. So you're starting to teach kids about privacy, private and public, versus you're not a bad kid because you did it in the living room. It's almost like teaching a kid, don't leave your cups on the table, thanks. Could you bring them into the sink? Because that's where dirty cups belong, right? They don't belong, scattered all over the house. So it's like one of those, how do you teach your children, the behaviors.
Right. Validating and educating.
Yes, you want to validate because you want them to feel good about that your body could feel that good. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Come in for sex therapy?
For sex therapy, yeah.
You could, there could be a list of reasons, right? You could have people coming in who co-own a problem. That's probably the easiest one, right? But that's true in most couples' work. They both come in and say, we have a sexual issue. We're either not having sex enough, we're not, so they're on the same page. Those are the easier couple of cases, whether it has to do with sex or whatever, right? The harder ones are what we call the discrepant cases, where people come in and it could be that one is coming in under duress. Some people come in afraid. I've had many actually partners say, I'm coming here because I'm afraid if I don't deal with the sexual issue, my partner's either going to have an affair or they're going to leave me. So sometimes they're not coming because they really would. In fact, they kind of would accept their sexual life, that it's good enough, or it's defensively lived. In other words, they're fine with no sex because sex is really fraught for them. So if their partner didn't have a problem with it, I'm okay not having any. They may not say that in front of a partner. They may say that to me alone, but it's important material to get. So they can come in with different, or it could be more of what we can call the more behavioral problems. Like a man could come in and say, I really am disturbed by my erectile dysfunction or difficulties, and the partner could say, yes, that's true. It's really affecting our sex life. Women with painful penetration. So there could be physical issues people are coming in with. There could be more of desire is the number one issue. That's no great surprise, right? So the number one issue we deal with is people coming in either with no desire, either one has it, or the discrepant desire, where one person has more desire than the other, and it's creating problems. So those are the most common, probably the desire issues. And then sometimes wrapped within those could be issues of erectile issues. You could lose desire if your body doesn't do what you think it should, or if there's frustration or shame about that, or conflict about it, that you could even not consciously but unconsciously just tamp it down. Trauma could be another one, either known or unknown. Rape, assault, incest, that someone either has dealt with in individual therapy or never dealt with, and it affects the sex life. And sometimes it's not that type of abuse. It could be, I've found in histories that what connects the shutdown in desire or functioning has more to do with relational trauma. So it could be like divorce in a family. It could be an affair that happened. It could be a mental illness of a parent that never got treated or acknowledged. It could be substance abuse in a parent. Things that create more like what we say attachment wounds and trauma and relational trauma could be the source of sexual shutdown. So any of that can happen.
Which is why I think it's all the more important that you do take this kind of extensive sexual history.
I'm a big fan of it, yeah.
It sounds like so many of these factors are very likely relevant to what's coming up.
Totally, yeah. Now, the field of sex therapy, just historically, that has been more cognitive behavioral. Some therapists would be just in the present moment. They believe that's where the work happens. You have X, Y, or Z sexual issue. Let's just deal with how can we make a change now. And for me, it's my analytic training, I just think, and my couples training, the relational context. All these symptoms are happening, though, within a context, a life lived and a couple context, so why not take history? I've only regretted when I haven't taken the history. That's been more of a regret.
Because then there also seems to be two schools of thought in sex therapy, which is that sexual issues are a function of relational problems, like there's some kind of miscommunication, there's some kind of attachment issue, and then there are some psychologists who say, sometimes there can be everything going very well in a relationship, and then just sexual problems emerge.
Yes. And both can be true. We're going to be feminist, right? And say it's probably both and, not either or.
Those are really interesting couples, I think. The couples where things are going well.
That's right.
In other
areas. Yeah, they're like good friends or...
Well, there's this whole area, I don't know if you've read, is Pepper Schwartz's work on pure marriage. I wrote a paper on this earlier because I was so fascinated by it. But Pepper Schwartz did this incredible study. She's a sociologist and a sexologist I think it's the University of Washington. And she and Philip Blumstein, back in the 80s, decided to do a massive national study on couples. And what was so great about it at the time was they actually did the effort to get heterosexual couples who were married, heterosexual couples who were cohabitating but not legally married, gay male couples, and lesbian couples. So they made a real effort in the early 80s to make sure they had balanced groups of those four types. And then they compared them on, I think, how they dealt with money, sex, power. There were a few different variables. But one of the most interesting things was they found that there were these two types of couples, even across those four groups, which are the ones that they called more traditional couples, which meant power was not equally distributed, and one person kind of called the shots more than the other. But it wasn't a conflictual thing. In other words, they were comfortable with that. And heterosexual couples, many times it was the man calling the shots, and in gay male and lesbian couples, some of them had those arrangements. And then there was this other couple type, though, called the pure marriage, and that's what they called it. And what they were curious about was the relationship between pure marriage or traditional, and then how quality of sex was or frequency. And I always love talking to people about this when I teach, because I say, well, guess what? Which couple do you think, more the traditional couples or the pure marriages, had the most sex? And which didn't?
Traditional. The power struggle had more and better sex.
More sex, yes.
I think there's something about sex that can be very intrinsic to power and kind of dominance and submission, and there creates a kind of different tension. When you have peer-to-peer, it can be very familiar. It can kind of be the antithesis of what sex is, which is like novelty, unfamiliarity, unpredictability.
Maybe some aggression.
Yeah, right. So, but Pepper Schwartz at that time, and she wrote about this, it was really wonderful at the time. She said, here I was a feminist my whole life, and I was thinking the feminist movement has done good things for women, especially would do good things for women sexually. And so wouldn't it be great to have this whole generation of, let's say, heterosexual relationships where the men and the women have real equality and they're both really committed to it. So that means, let's say, if the woman's job opportunity comes out in California, the man will pick up and leave and go there to support her, right? Isn't that great? Or they're sharing raising the kids. And then these pure marriages had less sex. And she's like, wait a minute, how does that work? That felt so confusing to her. And you're right, like, the analyst in me can make sense about that, because so much analytic work in sexuality talks about needing to be, and these words may feel uncomfortable to the average person, but in analytic terms, it's not that violent. But, Christopher Bolas talks about the need for ruthlessness in good sex, or Otto Kernberg talks about, the aggression in sex. So just you brought up those words. And those are healthy. And often with couples, I need to explain to them the difference between aggression or even ruthlessness and violence. Because for some folks, especially men, can be very concerned that, that especially men in pure relationships, I can't want to be that aggressive to my female partner, because isn't that their biggest fear, is to be called a perpetrator, or to be a man who, either they or their partner perceives as being abusive. So some people really need help in distinguishing between abuse or violence and healthy but hot, exciting power play, aggression, submission. And I'm not even saying BDSM, which is the much more formal forms of that, but even just in regular ways. So some women will come in and complain in those discrepant desire couples. It's the woman who has more desire. There's kind of this cultural idea that those discrepant couples, it's mostly always the men coming in and complaining. There are a whole lot of women who come in and they're the one complaining. And it's the man who's either inhibited or has less desire. And in some of those cases, when I dig deeper, both in the couple and in the individual sexual histories, I look for, are there any ways that this man may have had, as a boy, experiences where there was violence or aggression. And then what they did unconsciously was combine that with, now they can't go to playful, healthy aggression because they were witnesses or recipients of violence and abuse that got conflated with aggression, right? So to unpack that in sexual histories, let's say, and help people understand how that might be related to, let's say, low desire. That's all unconsciously. This isn't in the conscious mind. That's why, I could go on and on about sexual histories. I think you can miss so much if you don't appreciate how unconscious kinds of issues. So sometimes I'll say to people, make them laugh a little humor in therapy doesn't hurt. But I'd say, all sex is group sex. And then they laugh. No, and I'll say, because when you're in bed, you think you're just with one partner. You're not. You're with your parents, with your grandparents, the intergenerational trend. And some people go, too much information. Yeah. But, when they can
be a turn off.
I mean, that's the whole basis for the sexual history. Yeah. Like the intergenerational transmission of trauma is really interesting that we talk about in family systems. You get people whose, let's say, parents went through the Holocaust, or grandparents at this point, went through the Holocaust, and then how the depressive or the anxiety issues can come down and might even affect sexuality. Or sometimes people's grandmothers were raped, and that trauma went down through that parent, the parent side, to this person now, and it's operating in their relationship now. So there is a lot of group sex going on with all of that you bring in.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the techniques you've talked about or written about is this idea of the sex menu.
Yes,
Is that what it's called?
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how you implement that in therapy?
Yeah, and that actually answers your earlier question, which I didn't answer completely, is how do you help people feel more comfortable talking about sex? Because other than let's say the history, after the history is done, after all those sessions, toward the end of the history, I'll say to the individual, we start to identify what narratives have we identified that you live with that's operating now and affecting your sexual intimate life now, and to get permission to bring that into the couple. So then after the history taking, we could spend 2 to 3 sessions sharing my narratives and their, what we found, and to understand how they're co-creating or maintaining what's going on. So that helps people feel more comfortable about sex, because if they talked about something with me, and then I'd say, and sometimes the partner might say, Suzanne, could you tell my partner? I give you permission to, but I'd like you to be the first one to talk about it. So sometimes I'm the one to say, they were abused when they were 6, or this is what happened, and and I'm happy to be that messenger. Or sometimes they can say it now. They can put words to their sexual life because I already am part of it. They kind of rehearsed with me, and they know I'm their ally and that I support them and don't shame them. So that's one opening about talking about sex. And the second is a much more behavioral-oriented exercise, which I love, maybe because I'm Italian, I love food, whatever. But the food, the food sex, analogy is not new. But I love to bring some humor and lightness, because so many people come in with sexual issues. It's so fraught and heavy. So to have some opportunities to start to lighten it up. So with the sexual menu, it's basically saying, look, we do much better with food sometimes in the culture than we do with sex. Like if you and I are going out, and I like Chinese food the best and you like Italian the best, I'm not going to shame you. Why do you like Italian? What's wrong with you? So we don't shame each other for different preferences, right? And we usually will cooperate. So I might say, well, you like Italian, why don't we do Italian tonight for you? And then maybe next week we'll do Chinese for me, or whatever, right? And then when we're sitting at the restaurant, you might say, you know what, I'm starved. I'm going to have an appetizer, an entree, and a dessert. And I might say, I'm not really that hungry. I'm just going to have maybe an appetizer. Okay. Or we might show up and I might say, I'm not hungry at all, but I'll come and I'll keep you company and you eat, and we'll talk while you eat. Now, I talk that way with the food because I'm talking about, this can apply to sex. Like, why do people then wind up being shamed? Either they shame themselves or the partner because you really like receiving oral sex, but you don't like to give it. And why does that have to be shameful? Now, it might mean that I really like receiving oral sex. Okay, so how are we going to manage that? Not with shaming you or shaming me, but how do we work with differences? So the menu then, once I say, can we be as open or fluid that we might be with our different tastes in food, can we bring that to sex? Then I tell couples, I want you to go home, and I want you to write everything you can think of that is sexual, sensual, erotic. I really try and use words that, again, almost like sexuality versus sex, much more broadly defined, so they're not just coming in feeling like they have to write intercourse, oral sex. Then come in with, I say, think of your 5 senses. What would you associate with erotic or sensual or sexual that you see, or you hear, or you smell, or you taste?
Examples of things?
Yeah, so I'll sometimes say, like, looking at a sunset. Maybe that feels really erotic for you. So I intentionally include non-body, non-sexual, to give them permission to begin to become aware of, well, who is it? Who am I in the world that makes me feel alive or passionate or turned on or just awake? So I do intentionally include, maybe cooking a meal together and eating it together for some people might feel sensual. That's why sometimes, the candlelit dinner is for some people, that's foreplay. And then I say, but also you can include physical things, sure. But I also include smell and taste, because those are some of those areas that people can have shame about. Like, that could be erotic turn-ons that they think there's something wrong with them, like people who might be turned on by the smell of sweat, let's say. or the taste of semen or vaginal fluid might turn them on, or feces, or let's do the whole body fluid. So it gives them permission to start to say, include all the senses. And then what I want you to do is write down as many as you can think of. That it doesn't have to be too long, too short. Try not to think, what's my partner going to think? What's Suzanne going to think? Just try and write them down. Free associate. Don't share them with each other, but bring them in. And we're going to have you read them out loud in session. And we're going to talk about them. So that's like a structured kind of exercise that could get people first just to think about them. It's interesting to do for yourselves. You could do that tonight when you go home. It's a fun thing. Because what would you put down on a list like that? It's really fun. And then what also is interesting, like, do they not share it? Like, it gives you a little idea of how differentiated is this couple. Like, some couples can't bear writing this down and not sharing it before they come in. And other people really can't come in.
Or too terrified to bring anything in.
That's true. That's right. I've had some people come in with 1 or 2, and I've had other people come in with like pages. I had one man who actually was a chef who used his special computer at work to create a menu.
Oh, so
he came in with appetizers, nibbling on her ear, kissing the back of her knees or whatever.
Laminated and then she as a couple.
Is that hilarious? And some people were really playful about it.
That'd be a great Valentine's gift.
It is a great Valentine's gift. And then what I have them do, which is really essential, is that when they come in, I say, who would like to go first? And let's say if you went first, then I say, now what I'd like you to do is just to listen and not to make any comments, and that includes no nonverbal comments if you can manage, like no eye rolls, or because I'm trying to create safe space for this person to share this list. And they're gonna share it with me, and there's no crosstalk. So the person who's listening is actually now going to see, it's almost like a version of sexual history taking, right? Because they're gonna see me talk to this person about their items in a non-judgmental, curious way. So let's say she has oral sex on there. And it's also a chance to do some psychoeducation. I might say, I'm wondering, for some people, they like to give or receive oral sex, but other people prefer one over the other. Nothing really wrong with that. Just, people can have different feelings. How about you? You just mentioned oral sex, but you didn't say if you have any preferences. How about that? The other good thing about it is that I've already done the sexual histories. So part of what someone could be sharing with me that could be shameful or secretive is something around a body part or a sexual activity that they've never been able to talk about with their partner. So guess who gets to raise the issue? I do. And the partner doesn't have to know this came from them because I can bring it up. So let's say if the person put down, let's say they put down anal sex, and I'd say, some people are very uncomfortable with anal sex because they get kind of grossed out they're fearful to do it because they're afraid that once they get down there, so to speak, that if there's some feces, they're going to get really grossed out. That's just a really common thing. What's it like? What do you imagine it'd be like for you? Right now, in the history, that person could have told me that they were really so grossed out and disgusted that that's the reason why they never did anal sex again with their partner. The partner never had a clue. So I'm raising it so that I could say, hopefully, if either one of you have anal sex on your sexual histories, like a lot of couples, they could have issues about cleanliness, or maybe then cover some issues about enemas, or there's a great book by, Morin's book about anal pleasure and health. Maybe you'll read Jack Morin's book. It's a way that you can integrate some of the sexual history into the questions.
It's like an invitation and also a time to provide education.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you're also role modeling. So hopefully, again, when you said, how do you help couples become more comfortable, hopefully they see me relate like that with her. Then when you two go home, and then you'll see me do it with her, then when you go home, you get to start to hopefully, even unconsciously, just say, I could ask that question better. I could say, what's that like for you? Or, how come you feel excited about that, or whatever. So you're also role modeling how to talk.
What do you see happening for couples during that process?
Well, sometimes they're really surprised. Like, what's really, one of the most interesting outcomes can be, let's say in that discrepant desire case, where one person feels like they're like Superman sexually, and the other one's like a deadbeat, or, and it could be some anger about it. And then that supposedly low desire person comes in with quite a rich sexual menu. Right? And sometimes it's interesting to see how they can't have any crosstalk, but once both people share their lists, that's when I open up the floor and I'll say, so now you heard both your lists and how we talked about it. Any questions for each other? Any surprises? Sometimes the quote high desire person could be surprising. I didn't know you like to do all that stuff. You could realize after 20, 30 years, some people never talked about sex.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody could think she never wants to give blowjobs, and the woman likes to give blowjobs. And they never talked about it, So sometimes then, once they're past the surprise, they can feel very sad. Grief can come up. Like, I can't believe we lived together for 20 years, and I always felt I wanted this, and you would have done it, and we never talked about it. People can cry. They can grieve. People can get angry. Let's say a person has masturbation on there, and they talk quite a lot about masturbating in a discrepant desire couple, and the person with the higher desire say, oh, well, you're having all this sex with yourself and you can't have it with me? Great, what's that about? They could be angry. So you never know how the processing is going to go, but hopefully after doing so much of that dyadic separately, you're creating enough safety and messages about let's be kind of honorable with this, and let's be, respectful, and let's be curious and non-judgmental, that you could share feelings without being judgmental. And that's then an opportunity to say it's fine to feel angry about some of this stuff, or to feel sad or grief stricken, but let's not attack your partner or yourself because you have these feelings. You could express those feelings, but not through criticism. So it's an opportunity to help them separate affect, kind of sharing with attacking.
Yeah, it sounds like the menu, there's kind of like a natural therapeutic process that emerges. Not only be able to talk about these things, but also even solutions that seem like they emerge. Like, if we both have this interest.
That's right.
And didn't know about it, let's try it.
And then I follow that up with a couple sexual menu assignment. I'll often say, now you both have your own. Now I'd like you to go home. Now this is a joint assignment. Take both your menus and create a couple menu of everything you both feel you could do now. And then make a separate list of what you're not ready to do now. And that's fine. So I normalize that, it's fine to have that one where I'm not ready for anal sex, or I'm not ready for oral sex, or whatever it is. And then they come in with their couple menu. Now you've got a list to be able to start giving homework assignments. So then, let's say with the person who's been sexually abused, who's terrified to do anything because just the whole notion of lack of control and unpredictability feels too much like the abuse, well, now they've got the script. So then with some survivors, with the other person's permission, I could say, how about if Mary or John picks from the list? Is that okay with you? And the partner could be thrilled. Like, it's like, wow, we're going to even try it? That's great. And if they feel, my partner feels safer by picking the item so they have control and predictability, let's do it. So it could be used in that way. Some are more playful. They'll just take them all and write them on pieces of paper, cut it up, throw it in a hat, and say, okay, Sunday night, we're going to pick the thing we're going to do this week. So some people can be playful about it. But it really is a good tool for therapists to have that couple menu. And I have some couples that once they become more fluid sexually and they're now having sex, I don't have to give assignments and all that, that they still go back to their sexual menu because I just think it's so much fun. And also I tell them sexual menus are not engraved in granite. They can be fluid. They can change. You could add more things to it. You could change them. So it's really a wonderful container. I think in sex therapy that the creation of containers is so important. The container of the therapy is there, the container that you could help, partners co-create safety, and then these assignments could actually create, like a sexual menu could be a container.
Right. How important is it for partners to be open to either trying new things that their partner wants or making some sacrifice? If one person doesn't like giving oral sex, but the other partner really enjoys it and it's really important to them.
The idea of compromise and relationship.
Yeah, so that's true. That's good in all right? Let's say I hate to go to movies, but my partner loves movies. All right, I'll go to a movie once a month, but will you come to church with me? I hate going to church. Whatever. Isn't that part of good relationships? But also, let's say with the person who doesn't like to give the oral sex, I deconstruct a lot. So if someone says, I don't like oral sex, I'd say, let's really figure out how come. And I also normalize. There can be lots of things about doing oral sex that people have very common concerns about, like, maybe how it smells down there, or how I smell down there, or, how it tastes, or in my mind, or my parents who would say, that's a sin, you're only supposed to have intercourse, or whatever, right? So I try both as a couple. If I know that's a big presenting problem because they come in with it, then I would also explore it in the individual sessions to see, can we get to some of what makes them not like it that we could address? So sometimes, let's say cleanliness is an issue, then you check out, well, could you take showers before you do it? Or, you want to put some whipped cream on there and chocolate. What's your favorite taste? If you're afraid of taste, put your favorite, dessert on his penis and try it out, or whatever, to bring a playfulness and a creativity while normalizing that. Because the partner could feel wounded by it. Some people feel like if someone's not relating to a body part of theirs, they could feel really hurt.
It's a rejection.
Yeah, absolutely. Are my breasts not, you don't like my breasts, you don't like my penis, yeah.
I'm also wondering too, with discrepant desire. I mean, one issue that I've heard, for example, if a man maybe has a higher libido than a woman, and the woman is torn about whether she should just engage in sexual activity to please her partner, and then this sort of inner conflict of, am I just doing this and forcing myself to have sex just to kind of compromise? And where that kind of balance goes between like knowing what your boundaries are and holding true to what you want versus just doing it to kind of make the situation. That is so important. That's a major issue, and it could be women to men, but it could be men to women too, or whatever, How, and there's this notion in sex therapy called willingness, which I like a lot. And willingness is different. This is Joanne Lulin's work, who she was Masters and Johnson trained, and she thought that the Masters and Johnson model wasn't adequate enough for women. She felt it was much too kind of focused on just function. You just get aroused and desire, and then arousal, and then orgasm, and that's how men operate more than women. A lot of women just had issues with orgasm or with desire. So she came up with this great model that starts with willingness, not desire. And that is such a major concept I use all the time that can help people, first of all, not feel broken because they don't feel desire. Because a lot of people feel there's something wrong with them that they don't feel desire. And a lot of work now up in Canada, Laurie Brado's work and Rosemary Besson's work, these are all really important sexologists, all women up there, who actually did a lot of studies on women's sexuality and found that actually the model that says desire arousal actually is not appropriate for many women. That it may at some point in your life, probably Emily Nagoski might have talked about this too, right? Responsive versus spontaneous.
Responsive versus spontaneous, or another way is to say, for some people, some women, desire follows arousal. It doesn't precede it. And to normalize that and to educate patients about that I talk about that all the time. When you say that in a first session, especially, let's say, the woman's the one with the low desire, and this could be in lesbian couples too, by the way, not just heterosexual couples. When I say this research, I can see their whole bodies changed. All of a sudden, they're like, "Oh my God, I'm not dysfunctional. I'm not broken." Because this research, and that research was so powerful that changed the DSM. So our DSM is different because of that research. That now there is no low desire, hypoactive sexual desire, dysfunction for women anymore. How about that? I wish they would do that for men too, by the way. I think men get left out of this because there are a lot of men for whom desire is not that easy. And then they have the additional cultural kind of burden that men are supposed to always be hot to trot, right? They're always supposed to want it. They're always supposed to get hard at the drop of a hat. And so many men actually...
So much pressure.
A lot of pressure. And a lot of men really, their desire follows more connection, arousal, safety.
And would it turn off if you think there's something dysfunctional about you?
Totally. Once you start feeling broken, who the heck wants to get close to that one?
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So... what I like to say to people with a narrative approach about the sexual response cycle models is that you're not broken. The model's broken for you. So you know what? Masters and Johnson doesn't work for you, but it's not because you're broken. It's that model is inadequate for you. So how about Lulin's model? You could start with willingness, not with desire. You can end in pleasure, not orgasm, because that's what Lulin offered, which was radical. She said you could start with willingness, end in pleasure. Once you move from orgasm to pleasure, now you're cooking, because pleasure is a subjectively experienced phenomenon. Nobody could say, what's wrong with you, this muscle didn't start moving, called an orgasm. So you could feel pleasure just by holding your partner as they come or something. It really gives a broad frame. And then Bassolin's work actually expanded it even more, and she included things like emotional connection could be an endpoint.
What makes a good sexual partner?
Wow. Well, how about what would make a great partner, period? You know, someone who is a good listener, someone who is non-judgmental, someone who's playful, someone who's curious, someone who's willing to be vulnerable, someone who's willing to learn or try new things, someone who can really state their truth. You know, it's the kind of thing where I almost think sexual partner wouldn't be any different than partner, right? Or best friend. Is those kinds of qualities. That reminds me of, you know, next to the work that I was talking about earlier about Peggy Kleinplatz's work, you know, what makes for optimal sexual experiences over the long term is most of those characteristics had nothing to do with orgasms or body parts. It was talking about being connected, being in sync, being vulnerable, being empathic. Those were all the across male, female, gay, straight, kinky, non-kinky. Optimal sex had to do with those kind of relational characteristics.
What's the advice would you give to couples seeking sexual satisfaction or sexual enhancement?
The absolute number one thing I think about is lift the criticism. You know, lift whatever criticism is going on. Be meditative. You know, notice what your mind is saying about self or other, and whatever is negative. You know, become a meditator to see if you can kind of disengage or let that negative thought move, just like any other meditation. You know, hopefully our mind, I often say to patients, our minds are not our friends. First of all, in general, right? That's why we're all busy psychotherapists. If people's minds were more their friends, we'd be out of business. But with sex, it's especially not our friend, because most of the time there is something shameful. I'm broken. My partner doesn't find me attractive. I don't find me attractive, or I don't like his or her body, or whatever's going on. So I would say, you know, if you can lift the negative thoughts.
Towards yourself and your partner.
Self and other. Yeah. And maybe in relation to sex in general. You know, people who really think sex is bad, or, you know, you shouldn't be able to be that, you shouldn't be that sexual. But yeah, the negative thought, I would say that's it, the mind.
Yeah.
The body knows what to do if your mind gets out of the way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so much fun to talk to both of you.